Greetings, comrades. Welcome to the new episode of Deep Dive to Marxism podcast series, which we explore the Marxist perspective on philosophy, science, and society through the lens of dialectical materialism. It's really great to have you with us in this episode. By the way, we sadly want to inform you that this is the final episode of this podcast series. Thank you for being with us this far.
Yeah, it really has been just a truly remarkable journey exploring all these texts with you. And, while it's definitely bittersweet to reach the conclusion of this particular series, I mean, the work of actually understanding the analytical frameworks that shape our world, well, that never truly ends.
Exactly.
Yes.
I completely agree. And honestly, I really can't think of a better, more foundational topic to close out on. So shifting our energy right now, let me just ask you, comrade listening to us, a seemingly simple question.
Well, I like where this is going.
Right. So why did the Roman Empire fall? Was it because of a string of incompetent emperors? Was it some kind of moral failing? Or was it actually a mathematical inevitability based on the inherent limits of a slave-based agricultural economy?
That is the big question, isn't it?
It really is. And today we're looking at an explosive stack of sources to try and answer how we even begin to look at history. We have articles, videos, and books primarily drawn from In Defense of Marxism.
Right.
We are talking about foundational texts and contemporary analyses by authors like Alan Woods, Josh Holroyd, Fiona Lally, Rob Sewell, Margarita Colella, and Adam Booth.
It is just a phenomenal lineup of thinkers. I mean, they've dedicated themselves to outlining and defending the core tenets of Marxist theory. And what these sources collectively attempt to do is provide a scientific lens, a very specific methodology for dissecting human development.
Yeah, and the mission today is crystal clear. We are going to distill the absolute essence of historical materialism. And we're doing this specifically for a comrade who might be, encountering this specific theoretical framework for the very first time.
Which is so important because diving into Marxist theory can sometimes feel like, it feels like walking into the middle of a highly complex, slightly intimidating conversation where literally everyone else already knows the vocabulary.
Oh, absolutely. It's daunting.
Yeah.
But we aren't going to do that to you today. We are taking this at a slow, easy-to-follow pace. We are stripping away the heavy, impenetrable jargon, and we are going to carefully break down the complex dialectical relationship between politics, economics, and the broader sweep of social development.
That is definitely the perfect approach because historical materialism, at least as it's presented in these texts, it's not meant to be this locked box of academic secrets.
Right. Yeah.
It is intended to be a practical tool, a method for understanding what the sources actually call the hidden mainsprings of human society.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the bedrock. What actually is historical materialism? Because when most of us are taught history in school, it just feels like a massive, exhausting timeline of memorizing dates.
Oh, completely. Just a list of stuff that happened.
Exactly. Like, this king conquered that land in 1066. This general won this battle in 1815. This brilliant inventor had a sudden eureka moment. It feels entirely random.
It absolutely feels random when it is taught that way. But the sources argue that this randomness is actually a feature, not a bug, of how history is taught within a capitalist educational framework.
Wait, really? A feature?
Yeah, exactly. Because to begin our explanation, we have to look at Alan Woods' foundational text, which is perfectly titled, What is Historical Materialism? And Woods makes this critical intervention right from the start.
Okay, what does he say?
He explains that the Marxist analytical framework looks for the underlying currents that drive human society. So according to this view, history is absolutely not just a series of unconnected, unforeseen, or, random incidents.
So it's not just one damn thing after another, as the old cynical quote goes.
Precisely. The materialist conception of history argues that while the road of human development is winding and complex, it is a road governed by underlying laws. Woods points out that from a Marxist perspective, the ultimate cause of all social change, all political revolutions, and all major historical shifts is found, it's not found in the human brain or in the sudden appearance of better ideas.
Right.
It's found in changes to the mode of production.
The mode of production. Okay, let's make sure we define that clearly for our comrade listening. We are talking about how a society organizes itself to produce the things it needs to survive, right?
Yes.
Like the food, the shelter, the clothing, the tools. It's the combination of human labor, the tools and technology available, which Marxists call the productive forces, and the social relations that form around doing that actual work.
That is exactly right. The foundational premise here is just basic biological necessity.
Right, you got to eat.
Exactly. Before human beings can write poetry, debate philosophy, paint masterpieces, or form complex political parties, they must eat, they must have shelter, they have to survive against the elements.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Therefore, the way a society organizes its physical survival, its mode of production, forms what Marx called the economic base. Everything else, so like the legal systems, the religions, the state structures, the dominant morality, the art, all of that forms this superstructure. And this superstructure arises from and is ultimately conditioned by that economic base.
So to use an analogy, if I'm understanding this right, it's like trying to understand why a skyscraper looks the way it does without looking at its foundation.
Oh, I like that. Yes.
You can't just look at a 50-story glass tower and say, well, the architect just had a really cool dream about glass and steel one night. You have to ask them material questions. Did the society have the metallurgy to forge that specific steel? Did they have the engineering mathematics to support the weight?
Right.
Did they have the massive economic capital required to fund a 50-story building? And, structurally, why did that society even need 50 stories of concentrated office space in the first place?
What's fascinating here is how perfectly your skyscraper analogy illustrates the Marxist critique of mainstream, or what the sources call bourgeois history.
Okay, how so?
Well, the bourgeois historian, according to this critique, looks only at the architect's diary and their personal genius. The Marxist historian, on the other hand, looks at the steel mill, the supply chains, the labor conditions of the construction workers, and the economic imperatives of urban real estate that made the architect's specific design materially possible and arguably inevitable.
But wait, let me push back here a little bit on behalf of our listener. Are the sources saying ideas don't matter at all? That humans are just like mindless drones acting out economic equations?
Not at all, and that's a crucial distinction that Woods makes. The superstructure, so the ideas, laws, and politics absolutely interacts with and influences the economic base.
Okay, so it goes both ways.
Yeah, it is a dialectical two-way street. However, historical materialism argues that in the final analysis, the economic base is the determining factor. You can have the idea for a glass skyscraper in the year 1200 AD, but without the material base of industrial metallurgy, that idea remains pure fantasy.
Oh, I see.
The material conditions set the boundaries of what is historically possible.
That makes a lot of sense. So if the way we produce things fundamentally changes, say, moving from hunting and gathering with stone tools to farming with metal plows, the entire structure of society, the laws, the religions, the power dynamics, all of that is going to experience massive seismic shifts to accommodate that new way of surviving.
Exactly. It's a series of actions and reactions across politics and economics, but we really have to contrast this Marxist method with the way history is analyzed by liberal and postmodern historians today. The sources highlight this contrast very sharply, particularly in a video lecture we reviewed titled, "Is History Bunk?"
Right, the mainstream academic view. How do the critics of Marxism look at the timeline of humanity?
Well, the lecture points out that liberal historians generally reject the idea that history is driven by objective material laws. And postmodernists, they go even further. They often reject the very concept of objective historical progress altogether.
Wait, they don't think we've progressed?
No, they will argue that saying humanity has progressed is merely a subjective point of view, a cultural bias born of Eurocentrism.
Yeah.
They argue that history is essentially chaotic, fragmented, and driven primarily by exceptional individuals. This is the classic great man theory of history.
Oh, right. So they claim that the fate of human society turns on the specific personalities or quirks or brilliant ideas of a few extraordinary figures, like Napoleon conquered Europe because of his unique genius, or Steve Jobs changed the world because of his unique vision.
Precisely.
But the sources push back on that postmodern argument incredibly hard, right? Because to say there was no objective progress, well, it just feels like ignoring reality.
They push back vehemently. The lecture is History Bunk, carefully addresses this postmodern skepticism. The Marxist counterargument is basically this. If history is entirely random, why is it that similar material conditions reliably result in similar historical events, similar social structures, and even similar character types reoccurring across entirely different continents and eras?
Wow, that is a really good point.
Furthermore, the authors argue that to say there is no objective progress is frankly absurd when we look at the development of the productive forces. There is an undeniable objective line of progress in human mastery over nature. From stone tools to the invention of the wheel to the steam engine, right up to modern spacecraft and global digital communication.
Yeah, you really can't just hand-wave away the material difference between dying of a minor tooth infection at age 20 in a hunter-gatherer society and having access to modern antibiotics and robotic surgery. That is objective, measurable material progress in humanity's ability to manipulate the natural world.
Exactly. But the texts are careful to clarify that this progress is not a straight, smooth, upward line. It is dialectical.
Dialectical, meaning full of contradictions.
Yes,
Based
it
on-
moves through immense contradictions.
Right.
It involves periods of massive forward leaps, followed by periods of agonizing stagnation, structural crisis, and even temporary regression or collapse, like the Dark Ages in Europe. But the general overarching trajectory, driven by the relentless development of the mode of production, is undeniable.
And what blew my mind in the reading is that this isn't just a theory confined to human social history. The sources argue it actually mirrors the way the natural world itself operates.
It really does.
This brings us to Margarita Colell's article, Engels Was Right. I found this piece incredibly compelling because it bridges the gap between Marxist philosophy and modern hard science.
It is a brilliant piece of synthesis. Colella discusses how recent scientific papers have reignited debates about the biological development of humankind. Over the last few decades, massive advances in the hard sciences, ranging from evolutionary biology to cosmology, have, according to the article, increasingly validated the need to study all fields of knowledge with a dialectical approach.
For a comrade who might be new to the term, let's define dialectics simply. It's essentially the philosophy of constant motion, right? Understanding things not as static, frozen objects, but as dynamic processes that are constantly interacting, possessing internal contradictions that eventually force them to change.
That is a great working definition. Colella points out that nature itself operates dialectically. The universe is not a static photograph. It is a cinematic film in a state of permanent transformation. For a very long time, the concept of gradualism dominated science.
Gradualism.
Yeah, the idea that evolutionary change or geological change happens only in tiny, imperceptible, incredibly slow, uniform steps over millions of years. But modern science has heavily challenged this. Colella points to the theory of punctuated equilibrium in evolutionary biology, famously developed by scientists like Stephen Jay Gould.
Oh, I remember reading about this. Punctuated equilibrium basically argues that you look at the fossil record and you see species staying exactly the same for millions of years. Total stasis. And then suddenly an environmental stressor hits and boom, you have a rapid, explosive burst of evolutionary change and the sudden appearance of entirely new species in a very short geological time frame.
Exactly. It is long periods of stasis punctuated by sudden qualitative leaps. And Colella's article argues that this biological reality sounds exactly like the Marxist view of human history.
Oh, wow.
You have long periods where a certain economic system, let's say European feudalism, seems incredibly stable, permanent, ordained by God. It exists for centuries. But beneath the surface, tiny quantitative changes are happening. New technologies are being developed. New trade routes are opening. A new merchant class is slowly gaining wealth.
And the tension builds up.
Yes, the tension builds. The internal contradictions within the feudal system become too great. And then suddenly, the stasis breaks. You have an explosive social revolution that fundamentally changes the entire structure of society in a matter of a few years or decades.
So quantity transforms into quality. The pressure builds until the dam breaks. That is fascinating.
It really is. Friedrich Engels, Marx's closest collaborator, studied the natural sciences of his day extensively. He recognized that dialectics wasn't just a clever debate tactic invented by philosophers. It was the fundamental logic of nature itself.
That's incredible.
Colella's piece highlights that modern discoveries in cosmology, like the life cycles of stars, which exist in a balance of forces until they spectacularly go supernova, they constantly reaffirm this. When we study history through historical materialism, the argument is that we are simply applying the same scientific rigor and dialectical understanding of processes, contradictions, and transformations that a modern physicist applies to the physical universe.
That is a massive perspective shift. It takes history out of the realm of storytelling and puts it into the realm of science. But, and this leads us right into a major trap that people, including myself, often fall into. Because when you start throwing around phrases like historical laws, objective processes driven by the economy, and inevitable transformations, a lot of critics immediately jump up.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say.
Right. They say, wait a minute, if the economy determines everything, and history operates like a law of physics, then human beings have absolutely no free will.
And that objection brings us to a vital part of the literature. It is one of the most persistent and, according to the sources, intellectually lazy caricatures of Marxism. Daniel Morley tackles this head-on in his piece, Is Marxism Fatalistic? Opponents of Marxist theory constantly accuse it of being a teleological framework.
Teleological. Let's break that word down for our comrade. Teleology basically means that a process has a predetermined end goal, a final destination that it is magically being pulled toward, regardless of what anyone actually does. Like a movie script that has already been written, and we are just the actors forced to hit our marks.
Precisely. Critics accuse Marxists of believing that human history is preordained by cosmic laws to end in communism, no matter what actions people take. Morley points out that some critics even go so far as to accuse Marxism of being a secular religion, a form of historical Calvinism, where the role of an omnipotent God has simply been replaced by the iron laws of history.
Wow.
The claim is that in the Marxist view, there is no role whatsoever for active, conscious human beings to change history. We are all just passive victims of economics fate, waiting for the mode of production to magically do its thing.
I can totally see why that caricature is so heavily promoted by those who want to maintain the status quo. I mean, if you can convince working people that Marxist theory means just sitting around waiting for the inevitable collapse of capitalism, then you completely neutralize their political energy. It's a very convenient argument for the ruling class. Don't bother striking or protesting, folks. Just let the iron laws of history handle it.
It is entirely convenient, and Morley argues it is a complete misreading of the theory. He dismantles this caricature beautifully. Marxism absolutely does not make human beings passive victims of fate. In fact, the texts argue that Marxism is the only philosophy that fully explains the vital, indispensable role of active, conscious human beings in actually driving historical change.
How did Marx put it?
Marx himself addressed this directly. He famously wrote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past."
Let's hover on that quote because it really is the key to unlocking this whole debate. Men make their own history. That is a clear assertion of human agency. That is the conscious action, but not under circumstances they choose. That is the materialist base.
Exactly.
So to go back to my earlier example, you can have the most brilliant, revolutionary, egalitarian ideas in the world in the year 1200 AD. You can gather an army of peasants. But you are not going to build a modern socialist society because the technological and economic base, the massive industrial capacity required to eliminate scarcity, simply doesn't exist yet. The material circumstances restrict your options.
That is absolutely correct. The material conditions set the stage, they build the theater, they design the set, and they create the underlying conflicts. They generate the contradictions that eventually lead a society into crisis. But when a socioeconomic system enters a terminal crisis, the resolution of that crisis, whether society moves forward to a higher stage of development or collapses into mutual ruin, depends entirely on the conscious action of living, breathing, fighting human beings.
So the material laws create the opportunity, but humans must seize it.
Yes.
Okay, theory is great, but let's ground this in actual, factual, historical events. We want to prove to our comrade that this isn't just abstract philosophy. Adam Booth's piece, The Individual and the Marxist View of History, is perfect for this. The sources look at two monumental moments when the oppressed and exploited actively tried to seize the wheel of history: the Paris Commune and the 1917 Russian Revolution. Let's start with Paris. What actually happened there?
The Paris Commune of 1871 is analyzed in these texts as an earth-shattering event. It was the first time in history the working class briefly took power. Following the disastrous Franco-Prussian War, the material conditions in Paris were horrific. Starvation, a brutal siege, and a French bourgeois government that had essentially abandoned the city.
Right.
In response, the working class of Paris rose up. They didn't wait for iron laws to deliver them. They took immense, courageous action. They forced the bourgeois government to flee to Versailles, and they took power into their own hands.
And they didn't just take over the old government machinery, right? They completely dismantled it.
Yes, and this is what Marx found so profoundly important. They dismantled the old standing army and replaced it with the armed citizenry. They instituted radical democratic reforms. All officials were elected, subject to immediate recall by the voters, and paid no more than the average worker's wage.
That's incredible for 1871.
It was. They banned night work for bakers. They suspended debt collections. They proved, in practice, that the working class was fully capable of running a complex society without capitalists or kings.
But, and this is the heartbreaking part, The Commune was ultimately defeated. It lasted barely 2 months before it was ground in blood by the French army, who slaughtered tens of thousands of Parisians. So, the devil's advocate question. If the workers were so courageous and they took that necessary conscious action, why did it fail? Was the material base just not ready?
The texts argue that while the material conditions in Paris had ripened into a revolutionary crisis, and the workers definitely had the agency to seize power, what they lacked was the subjective factor.
The subjective factor, meaning leadership. Strategy?
Meaning a cohesive, theoretically clear, and resolute revolutionary leadership. A vanguard party. Because the leadership of the Commune was a mix of various radical factions, they lacked a unified Marxist understanding of the state and the ruthless necessity of defending their revolution against the combined forces of the old ruling class.
Oh, I see.
Adam Booth points out that they made fatal strategic errors born of this theoretical confusion. They hesitated to march on the weakened reactionary forces gathered at Versailles when they had the chance, which gave the enemy time to regroup.
That's a huge mistake.
And incredibly, they left the massive wealth sitting in the Bank of France completely untouched out of a misplaced respect for bourgeois property laws. Money which the fleeing government then used to finance the army that slaughtered them.
Wow. Just wow. So they had the objective crisis, they had the mass action, but the subjective factor, the theoretical clarity to know exactly what to do with the power once they had it, was the missing ingredient that led to tragedy. Which brings us perfectly to the contrast.
Right.
1917.
Yes. The texts present the 1917 Russian Revolution as the ultimate refutation of fatalism and the ultimate proof of the necessity of the subjective factor. As Adam Booth outlines, the objective material conditions in Russia were a nightmare. The Russian masses were groaning under the unprecedented horrors of World War I, mass starvation, and a deeply decayed, archaic, czarist regime.
The pressure was enormous.
Exactly. The material pressure was explosive. And so the masses rose up spontaneously and overthrew the Tsar in February 1917.
But overthrowing a king doesn't automatically mean you get socialism. The bourgeoisie, the wealthy capitalists, and liberal politicians immediately stepped in and tried to hijack the revolution to keep Russia in the war and protect private property.
Exactly. And if history were just automated iron laws, the story might have ended right there, with a crippled bourgeois democracy that eventually crushed the workers, much like what happened to the Paris Commune. But in Russia, there was a conscious element present that was absent in Paris. The Bolshevik Party, led by figures like Lenin and Trotsky.
Now, a critic might say, so Lenin just willed the revolution into existence through his great man genius. How does the Marxist view counter that?
By pointing out that the Bolsheviks absolutely did not create the revolution. The objective material conditions of imperialist war and mass starvation created the revolution. Lenin couldn't have sparked a revolution in 1905 or 1914 because the masses weren't ready.
Right.
But in 1917, the Bolsheviks provided the conscious vanguard. They had spent decades studying historical materialism. They understood the class dynamics. They were able to look at the situation and explain patiently to the working masses that the new bourgeois provisional government could not and would not deliver the three things the masses desperately wanted: peace, bread, and land.
Because delivering those things would require breaking with the capitalist class, which the provisional government totally refused to do.
Precisely. Through their active, conscious intervention, their slogans, and their clear strategy, the Bolsheviks guided the spontaneous, massive energy of the workers and soldiers toward the successful conquest of political power in October. The texts argue this was the moment the oppressed and exploited definitively overthrew the old order and established a workers' state.
So it was a synthesis.
Yes, it was the perfect, necessary synthesis of objective material conditions, the crisis of the system, and subjective conscious human action, the Revolutionary Party.
So, to summarize this point for our listener, the subjective factor is everything in those critical knife-edge moments of history. History sets the table, the economic contradictions cook the food, but human beings have to actually sit down and eat the meal, or it all rots.
That is a very vivid way to put it, yes.
But to really understand how the oppressed can rise up to overthrow an order, whether they fail in Paris or succeed in Russia, we first have to understand how that oppressive order was built in the first place. You can't dismantle a complex machine if you don't know how it was assembled. How did we get a society divided into classes in the first place? Hey, comrades, do you have any other idea or question about this subject? Please write in comments so we can discuss together.
Tracing this lineage is essential to the historical materialist method. To understand capitalism, we have to go back to the very origins of class society itself. For this deep historical perspective, the sources point us to Rob Sewell's introduction to one of the most profound foundational texts of the Marxist canon, Friedrich Engels' The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State.
This book, even just reading the summaries in the articles, is completely mind-blowing because it systematically shatters the most pervasive capitalist myth of all, the idea that greed is just human nature and that there have always been rich people and poor people, bosses and workers.
It is a vital myth to bust. Engels, utilizing the best anthropological data available in his time, which, the sources note, has only been further corroborated by modern archaeology and anthropology, demonstrates that for the vast, overwhelming majority of human existence, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived in classless, egalitarian societies.
What Marx and Engels termed primitive communism. Let's explore how that actually functioned. In early tribal societies, human beings lived in kinship groups. The mode of production was based on hunting and gathering.
And crucially, the productive forces, the tools and techniques available to them, were so low, so basic, that there was essentially no surplus wealth. Everyone in the tribe or clan had to work constantly just to ensure the day-to-day physical survival of the group. Yep. Whatever food was hunted or gathered was immediately consumed and shared among the community. Because there was no surplus, there was absolutely no material basis for one group of people to stop working and live off the labor of another group. It was physically impossible. Therefore, in these societies, there were no classes, no concept of private ownership of land, no money, no police forces, no prisons, and no state apparatus.
Okay, so if humans lived like that for 90% of our history, how did it all go so spectacularly wrong? How did we get from egalitarian tribal societies sharing antelope meat to a world with trillion-dollar corporations, billionaires going to space, and billions of people living in extreme poverty?
The historical materialist answer is that it wasn't because someone suddenly had a wicked, greedy idea one day, or because humanity suffered a moral fall from grace. It was driven by a monumental change in the mode of production, the agricultural revolution. The development of farming and the domestication of animals constituted a massive, unprecedented leap in human progress. Suddenly, human labor became far more productive. For the first time in history, a community could produce a surplus, meaning they could produce more food and resources than were strictly necessary to keep the producers alive that day.
And as soon as you have a surplus sitting in a grain silo, you suddenly have a completely new, incredibly dangerous historical question. Who controls the surplus?
Exactly. That is the pivot of human history. Initially, the administration of that surplus, storing it against famine, using it for trade, or supporting specialized artisans, fell to a minority of the community, often elders or religious figures acting on behalf of the whole.
Okay, that makes sense initially.
But over long periods of time, this minority consolidated its control over the means of production, the most fertile land, the irrigation systems, the herds. They began to appropriate the surplus generated by the labor of the majority for themselves. This, Engels argues, is the material origin of private property. And with the establishment of private property came the permanent division of society into antagonistic classes, the minority who owned the wealth and exploited labor, and the majority who performed the labor.
And Sewell's piece points out that Engels also links his economic shift to a profound social shift regarding gender. Engels called it the world historical defeat of the female sex. Can you explain the mechanics of how the agricultural surplus led to patriarchy?
It is a profound and highly relevant point. In primitive communist societies, lineage was generally traced through the mother matrilineal descent because paternity was not strictly monitored or economically vital. Women held immense social respect as the gatherers and the sunder of the kinship group. However, when men, through their role in agriculture and animal husbandry, began to accumulate this new private wealth, the herds and the land, they wanted to pass this wealth down to their own legitimate biological heirs. To ensure paternity, the patriarchal family structure was violently and systematically enforced, effectively subordinating women, turning them into property themselves, strictly controlling their reproduction to ensure the safe transfer of private property.
So the argument is that gender oppression, patriarchy, and class division are not separate, unrelated issues. They all share the exact same material root: the rise of private property.
That is the core Marxist argument. Furthermore, because society was now violently split into opposing classes with entirely irreconcilable material interests, the slaves versus the masters, later the serfs versus the lord society, was in constant danger of tearing itself apart in open, violent class warfare.
It sounds incredibly unstable.
It was. To prevent this mutual destruction, the ruling minority needed a mechanism to maintain their dominance, enforce property laws, and keep the exploited majority in check. That mechanism is the state.
So the state, meaning the police, the armed forces, the courts, the prisons, was not created as some neutral arbiter to make sure everyone plays fair.
According to historical materialism, absolutely not. The state arose historically as an instrument of class rule. It consists of armed bodies of men designed to enforce the property rights of the exploiting class and suppress the resistance of the exploited.
Okay, so tracking the timeline, we move from primitive communism through the massive leap of agriculture into ancient slave societies like Greece and Rome. Then Rome falls, and we move into feudalism in Europe, with lords, vassals, and serfs tied to the land. And eventually, out of feudalism, we arrive at the dominant economic system we live under today, capitalism.
Yes, the long road to today.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the defenders of modern capitalism love to tell a very specific, very comforting bedtime story about how their system was born. They tell us it emerged peacefully. They say that back in the day, a few hardworking, thrifty, clever individuals saved their pennies, invented some clever machines, and engaged in mutually beneficial free trade. Meanwhile, the lazy spendthrift people stayed poor and eventually became the employees of the clever ones.
That is what Marx sarcastically referred to as the bourgeois fairy tale of original accumulation. It reads like a children's fable. Josh Holroyd completely dissects this myth in his articles and lectures on freedom and slavery, the birth of capital. As Holroyd points out, drawing directly from Marx's Capital, capitalism did not emerge through peaceful trade, thrift, and a polite handshake.
Not at all.
It emerged incredibly violently from the embers of feudal society. Marx famously wrote that capital comes into the world dripping from head to foot, from every pore with blood and dirt.
Dripping blood from every pore. That is such a visceral, unforgettable image. And Holroyd's article shows it is completely historically accurate. He details the violent and tumultuous birth of this system in England through the Enclosure Acts. Let's break down the mechanics of the enclosures for our comrade, because it's crucial to understanding how a working class is actually created.
Under feudalism, peasants had traditional rights to farm the common lands, shared pastures and forests where they could graze animals and grow food to survive. But as the wool trade became incredibly profitable in Europe, the English nobility realized they could make vastly more money raising sheep than collecting rent from peasant farmers.
So they needed the land.
Yes. So they used their control of the state, the parliament, to pass the Enclosure Acts. Through legal decrees and brute military force, they literally built fences and hedges, violently driving millions of peasants off the common lands they had lived on for centuries.
They literally made it illegal for people to feed themselves off the land. Their homes were burned, their entire way of life was destroyed.
Exactly. This massive population of displaced, starving peasants was forced to wander the country as vagabonds. The state then passed incredibly bloody, draconian vagrancy laws, branding them, whipping them, and eventually forcing them into the rapidly growing cities to seek any work they could find. They were stripped of their ability to survive independently. They became the first wave of propertyless wage laborers, completely at the mercy of the early factory owners.
Yeah, they had no other choice.
Right, they had nothing to sell but their ability to work. This violent expropriation of the peasantry was the first great act of violence in the creation of the capitalist working class. It was not peaceful thrift. It was state-sanctioned theft.
But the horrors of the birth of capitalism were not confined to the English countryside. To truly understand the massive, unprecedented accumulation of global wealth that kickstarted the capitalist system, the sources argue we have to look across the oceans. This is where Fiona Lawley's powerful article, How British Capitalism Grew Rich Through Slavery, comes in.
Yes, and this is a vital component of the historical materialist analysis of global development. Lawley analyzes how the origins of British capitalism, and indeed European and American capitalism, are inextricably, fundamentally tied to colonial exploitation, the genocide of indigenous populations, and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade.
This connects so directly to the modern world, especially movements like Black Lives Matter, which have done so much to shine a harsh light on the racist colonial history of the imperialist powers. How exactly did slavery fuel the Industrial Revolution? What are the economic mechanics?
The mechanics are staggering. The immense wealth generated by the enslavement of millions of African people, their brutal transportation across the Atlantic, and their forced unpaid labor on the sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations of the Americas. This was the massive influx of raw capital that financed the Industrial Revolution. The cheap cotton picked by enslaved people in the American South fed the textile mills of Manchester. The massive profits from the sugar trade were funneled back into London banks.
So it wasn't just good business acumen and clever inventors in London and Manchester. It was the blood and unpaid labor of enslaved people in Jamaica, Barbados, and Virginia. The entire modern financial system, the banking systems, the insurance companies like Lloyd's of London, the massive shipping and railway industries, they all grew fat on the profits of human bondage.
Lawley's article makes the case that this imparts a crucial materialist perspective against imperialism. From this framework, racism was not just a pre-existing, unfortunate psychological prejudice that happened to infect the system by accident. Modern anti-Black racism was systematically developed, codified, and promoted by the ruling class as an indispensable ideological justification for the immensely profitable economic system of chattel slavery.
That's horrifying, but it makes total sense economically.
They had to construct a pseudoscientific, religious, and moral superstructure to justify treating human beings as disposable farm equipment because the economic base of plantation capitalism demanded it.
So what does this all mean for a new comrade looking at the world today, when they see the deep systemic racism woven into our institutions, or the massive, glaring inequality between the wealthy nations of the so-called global North and the heavily exploited nations of the global South? The Marxist perspective says they need to understand that this isn't a bug or a glitch in the capitalist system. It is the foundation.
Exactly.
Capitalism didn't simply emerge peacefully. It required violent expropriation, slavery, and colonial plunder. The staggering wealth of the imperialist nations today is built directly on top of centuries of global theft.
That is the uncompromising argument presented by historical materialism. It strips away the moralizing fairy tales and exposes the brutal, undeniable economic realities that built the modern world. And the sources suggest that recognizing this reality is terrifying to the current ruling establishment, which is why they invest so much energy and funding into universities, think tanks, and academia to muddy the waters, complicate the narrative, and distract people from this clear class-based Marxist analysis.
Which brings us perfectly to the modern battleground of ideas, navigating academic distractions and keeping theory practical. Hey, comrades. By the way, if you liked and interested in the topics in this episode so far, please don't forget to like, share, and comment. Also, we'd be appreciated if you subscribe to the channel to be informed about new episodes.
Navigating the academic landscape is a very real hurdle for anyone trying to seriously study Marxism today. The authors in our sources, particularly Josh Holroyd, argue that once you step into a university's sociology or history department, you are often bombarded with theories that sound incredibly radical, complex, and cutting edge on the surface, but are actually designed to blunt the revolutionary edge of Marxist analysis.
And we have a perfect, highly specific example of this in the source material. Josh Holroyd wrote a detailed article titled Marxism, the State, and the Tributary Mode of Production. What exactly is the tributary mode of production, and why are Marxists so frustrated by it gaining popularity in academic circles?
The tributary mode of production is a conceptual framework that has gained quite a bit of traction in left-leaning academic circles recently. Some academics present it as a sophisticated, modern, less Eurocentric update to Marx's original conception of historical development. Essentially, the theory attempts to group together a vast, incredibly diverse array of pre-capitalist class societies, ranging from feudal Europe to ancient dynastic China to the massive Ottoman Empire to the Aztec civilization, into one massive, blurred category called the tributary mode.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate. On the surface, to a beginner, that might sound plausible. The core argument is that in all these societies, a ruling elite extracted a tribute or a surplus from the peasantry, mostly through non-economic coercion, like military force taxes or religious authority. A king takes a cut of the wheat, an emperor takes a cut of the rice, and Aztec priest demands tribute. It's all just forced tribute, right? So basically, academia took centuries of highly distinct, complex human history, threw it in a blender, and slapped a tributary label on the smoothie. Why is this a problem for Marxist analysis?
It is a massive problem because it actively obscures the specific material dynamics of how those very different societies actually functioned internally, and crucially, how they transition from one stage to another. As Josh Holroyd dissects in his article, a close inspection of this theory, its methodology, and its origins reveals that it is not a development or an enhancement of Marxism at all. It is a fundamental retreat from it.
A retreat? How so? Break down the mechanics of why the smoothie approach fails.
Well, Marx and Engels were incredibly careful to distinguish between different pre-capitalist modes of production, such as the Asiatic mode, the ancient slave mode of Rome, and the feudal mode of Europe. They did this because the specific relations of production in each system contained unique, entirely different internal contradictions. Feudalism in Europe, with its highly decentralized structure, its specific relationship between the serf tied to the land, the local lord, and the slowly rising urban merchant classes in independent towns, created the precise, unique, internal contradictions that allowed capitalism to incubate, grow, and eventually violently overthrow the feudal lords.
So the specifics really matter.
They absolutely matter. If you just lump everything pre-capitalist into a vague, generic tributary category, you completely lose the analytical ability to understand why capitalism emerged specifically in Europe when it did, and why it didn't spontaneously emerge from the Ottoman Empire or dynastic China, despite them also extracting tribute. It flattens the rich dialectic of history into a static, useless category.
It's like looking at a great white shark, a bottlenose dolphin, and a nuclear submarine, and saying, well, they all move through the water and they're all gray, so let's just categorize them all under the swimming mode. You completely lose the evolutionary biology of the shark, the mammalian lungs of the dolphin, and the engineering mechanics of the submarine that actually explain how and why they function the way they do.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Yes, it destroys the analytical utility of the theory. And Holroyd makes a sharper point. He argues that this academic update is actually a conscious or unconscious concession to the relentless ideological attacks from reactionary opponents in the universities. Academics face immense institutional pressure to distance themselves from the revolutionary scientific rigor of authentic Marxism.
Because they want to keep their jobs.
Exactly. To get tenure, to get published, they often seek a version of history that sounds radical, but is ultimately acceptable to the bourgeois establishment. One that blurs sharp class lines, avoids discussing specific revolutionary transitions, and avoids the dangerous revolutionary conclusions that Marx drew.
This really gets to the heart of a broader problem with academic Marxism in general, doesn't it? It tends to completely divorce theory from practice. We have a fantastic resource on this specific philosophical problem in our stack. Alan Wood's piece, Marx's Revolution in Philosophy, Reflections on the Theses on Feuerbach.
Yes, the Theses on Feuerbach. These are just a few brief notes Marx jotted down in 1845, not even intended for publication, but they represent a monumental paradigm-shifting breakthrough in the history of human thought. In this article, Woods explains why these academic retreats, like the tributary mode, happen so frequently. It is because university professors are, by the nature of their profession, largely isolated from the actual gritty class struggle. They tend to treat philosophy and history as a purely intellectual game, a puzzle to be solved in a seminar room.
Woods quotes Marx's second thesis directly, and it is so powerful. Let me read it for our comrade. Marx writes, "The question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e. the reality and power, the decidedness of his thinking and practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking that is isolated from practice is a purely scholastic question."
It's just brilliant.
So let's translate this out of 19th century German philosophy. What does this actually mean for us today? It means we can't just sit in a comfortable ivory tower endlessly debating abstract definitions of the tributary mode or arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Truth cannot be proven on a whiteboard. Truth has to be proven in practice, in the real world, through action.
That is the very essence of Marxist philosophy, to passionately debate whether an idea is true while sitting in a comfortable armchair, totally isolated from the material reality of the world, is what Marx dismisses as a scholastic question, meaning it's a pointless academic exercise akin to medieval monks debating theology. For a Marxist, theory is never an end in itself. You don't learn it just to sound smart at parties. It is a guide to action.
Right.
If a historical or economic theory does not help the working class clearly understand its oppression, map out the terrain of the battlefield, and develop a practical winning strategy for its liberation, then that theory is useless, no matter how clever or sophisticated it sounds in a peer-reviewed journal.
Which is exactly why Marx famously concluded those theses with perhaps his most famous quote of all. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
Exactly. The point is not just to understand the mechanics of the machine, but to use that understanding to dismantle it and build something better. And that brings us seamlessly to the final synthesis of our sources, the three component parts of Marxism and their burning relevance today. Because if our goal is to actually change the world, we need to understand the complete theoretical arsenal at our disposal.
Right. We spent this entire deep dive focusing heavily on historical materialism. But as the introductory book, What is Marxism, explains clearly, historical materialism is just one pillar of a much larger structure. Marxism, as a complete framework, is broadly composed of three interrelated component parts. There's the philosophical foundation, which is dialectical materialism. There's the application to human society, which we've been discussing, historical materialism. And finally, there's Marxist economics.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that these three parts cannot be separated. They form a unified, comprehensive, and highly robust worldview. Dialectical materialism gives us the foundational philosophical method, the understanding of nature in constant motion, of processes, of internal contradictions, and of quantitative changes leading to qualitative leaps. Historical materialism then takes that dialectical method and applies it systematically to the study of human society and the evolution of class struggle.
And then the economics part.
Right. And finally, Marxist economics takes that exact same dialectical method and applies it specifically to dissecting the laws of motion of the capitalist system, uncovering the hidden secrets of surplus value, the exact mechanics of wage exploitation, and the inevitable mathematically certain crises of overproduction that periodically crash the system.
They feed into each other in a continuous loop. You can't truly deeply understand Marxist economics if you don't understand the violent historical process that forcefully birthed the capitalist wage labor in the first place. And you can't understand that history if you don't have the dialectical framework to analyze how the contradictions within feudalism forced that change.
Exactly. It is a holistic science.
Yeah.
And to bring all these threads together, we look to Alan Woods' concluding article in our stack, The Ideas of Karl Marx. Woods poses a critical, necessary question that every skeptic asks. Are these ideas, formulated by a man in a Victorian library over a century and a half ago, still relevant today?
And based on the sources we've read, the answer is a resounding yes. In fact, the argument is that they are perhaps more sharply relevant now than at any point in history.
Without a doubt. Woods explains how the deep historical perspective we've discussed today, tracing human development from egalitarian tribal societies through the bloody, state-sponsored creation of private property and capitalism to the monumental, earth-shaking heights of the 1917 Russian Revolution, proves the immense, enduring analytical power of Marx's method. When we look around at the cascading, overlapping crises facing modern society today, the explanatory power of Marxism is arguably unmatched by any mainstream economic theory.
Let's talk about those modern crises, because this is where the theory hits reality. We are looking at a global world that is supposedly richer and vastly more technologically advanced than at any point in human history. Yet we have deepening, agonizing poverty. We have sudden global economic crashes like 2008 that wipe out millions of livelihoods overnight. We have devastating imperialist wars being fought over resources, pipelines, and market dominance. And above all, we have a looming climate crisis that threatens the very habitability of the planet entirely because the profit motive of a few fossil fuel conglomerates prevents the rational, sustainable planning of the global economy.
All of these terrifying phenomena are entirely inexplicable to bourgeois economists and liberal politicians. To them, the 2008 financial crash, the spiraling global inflation, or the environmental collapse are just unfortunate accidents, policy mistakes by bad politicians, or unforeseeable black swan events. But through the lens of historical and dialectical materialism, the sources argue that these are not accidents at all. They are the inevitable structural symptoms of a socioeconomic system, capitalism, that has fundamentally outlived its historical usefulness.
The phrase Marx used is that the mode of production has become a fetter on the further development of society. Capitalism, which once drove humanity forward in a ruthless, bloody, but undeniable expansion of our productive forces and technological capability, is now actively holding humanity back. The rigid private ownership of the means of production, the fact that a handful of billionaires own the technology, and the artificial division of the world into competing, warring nation-states are suffocating our potential to solve these global crises.
That is the central burning contradiction of our epoch. The texts emphasize that humanity's productive forces have reached an unprecedented, miraculous level. We currently have the technology, the automated agriculture, the logistical networks to easily provide high-quality housing, advanced healthcare, free education, and a dignified standard of living for every single human being on the planet. The objective material conditions for a socialist society of superabundance exist right now, today. The base is ready. But, as we discussed with the Paris Commune, the subjective factor, the conscious, organized political action of the working class to seize control of these forces and rationally plan the economy, is what is currently missing and what must be built. Historical materialism teaches us that the transition to a higher stage of society is entirely materially possible, but it is not automatic. It will not happen by itself. It requires conscious, resolute, revolutionary action.
It requires us to deeply study the successes and failures of the past, to learn the agonizing lessons of the Paris Commune, to learn the strategic lessons of 1917, and to apply that scientific method to the material conditions of the 21st century. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for our comrade listening today. We spent this deep dive analyzing history, but let's apply this Marxist method to the very near future.
A vital exercise. If historical materialism teaches us that the ultimate underlying cause of all massive social and political change is a fundamental shift in the mode of production, we need to look very closely at the rapid, earth-shaking technological shifts happening in our own workplaces and industries right now.
Exactly. Think about the massive, rapid integration of artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, and extreme automation across global supply chains. These aren't just cool new gadgets to make our phones smarter. They represent a fundamental, colossal shift in the forces of production. They are drastically altering the way human labor interacts with the world, potentially eliminating the need for vast swaths of human toil.
So the question to mull over, the question to apply your new theoretical tools to is this. How might the material conditions of our current era, this massive explosion in productive capability driven by AI and robotics, violently colliding with the agonizing, restrictive contradictions of capitalist private ownership, be silently, forcefully preparing the ground for the next great shift in human history? The tension between the incredible liberating potential of these tools and the restrictive, profit-driven chains of capitalism is building to a breaking point. The skyscraper is groaning on its foundation.
I think we've covered all the ground, and here's the solid place to finish the episode and also the Deep Dive to Marxism podcast series. Thank you for tuning in so far. Please also check other playlists for our other deep dive and digestive contents. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to this video and subscribe to the channel. That's all for now, comrades. See you at future podcast series. Bye.